that nation issue and your article on nation, which, like in these times, is free. So don't leave this room without picking one up if you want to see it.
I love the In These Times.
It's good. It's good. Very good.
Yeah, very good.
Was that there were plenty of people at Port Huron in those early years of SDS who came from Marxist backgrounds, generally speaking from the Popular Front. But when they came into SDS and participated in it wasn't like leaving all of it behind. It was like what you had learned up to this point in this much more structured and dogmatic framework really didn't matter very much. And I can say this is true because it happened to me. It was that kind of transformative experience that once it was like a contact high, and I have to say the Port Huron Statement was the contact. Although the speech that Paul Potter made in Washington in April of 1965, "We must name the system," was fabulous and unbelievable. But when we got our hands on the Port Huron Statement, we wanted to get as many copies as we could, make them available to as many people as we could. It was like those socialist tracts in 1910. Its lecturers used to say, "Put it under your pillow when you go to bed at night."
Did they say that?
They did indeed. They were selling. That's how they made their money to go to the collection.
Yeah, there were 50 or 60 people there. Some came and went because there was preliminary polls. But of the 50 or 60, I would say 10 were Marxists by background. And a majority of them were anti-communists who were there to make sure that we were not going too far left or opposing the Cold War specifically. But that was very difficult for them to argue because we thought they were from another planet. And they thought they would be engaging us in an ideological dialogue, but we weren't part of the ideology. We had no idea what the hell they were talking about. And SNCC people would get up and say, "I don't give a shit what your ideology is. You come on down to Mississippi, we'll set up a platform, we'll get you a speaking for your presentation, and you go on about dialectical materialism as far as you can go, and you will be killed and taken away." That kind of silenced them because they didn't take the challenge. They didn't actually come with their soapboxes to Mississippi. The others were very interesting because they were young people, often from New York, often Jewish, who had been raised on communism by their parents and trade unionism. But they had gone through, as teenagers or even younger, the 1957 Khrushchev revelations about Stalin. Not to revisit that, but basically in their adolescence, they were told that they had been lied to and that Stalin was actually killing lots and lots of people. And this traumatized their families. Parents that had given their lives to this cause were one thing, but when you're raised on it as a red diaper baby to a teenager, and then around those adolescent years, you hear a different message, they went into shock. So it was not a tactic for them to say, "We have nothing to do with communism. We just don't want to start a nuclear war with communists," but it was genuine. They were actually breaking from their own genuine inheritance as children and young adults. And so the search was on for any kind of unifying spirit or doctrine, but there was no entrance for them. The interesting question is later, after 66, 67, why Marxism, Leninism, anarchism, Trotsky, why they were all introduced as better than participatory democracy. I think the reason for that had to do with the radicalizing experience of the war, the escalation of the war, the draft, the beatings, the black insurrections in the cities. There had to be a more revolutionary sounding explanation if you were really felt you were on your marching into tear gas, every weekend for the rest of your life. And in this quest, The one side was, well, reform has failed, so Port Huron, forget it. The other side of it was, now we're Maoists, or now we're supporting Lin Piao. And you know the miserable history of what then followed, and all disintegrated. And all this happened, it has to be a reminder to us, one and all, it all happened in a 6-year period. We went through 3 generations of SDS in 6 years. You're too old. He's from the old guard. You know, I'm like 1 year older than You're inexperienced. You don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, you're talking to somebody 2 years younger than you. We're not talking about 70-year-olds arguing with 20-year-olds. We're talking about 26-year-olds facing off with 22-year-olds. It all happened that rapidly.
But one of the important things here in Madison, in that very tumultuous period from 1969 through about 1973, is that we didn't go through the difficulties that happened in Boston and on the West Coast. As Rim 1, Rim 2 evolved, the movement here in Madison fairly well held together. And I think the reason is we organized something with the improbable name of a United Front. And it was a collection of about 20 different organizations.
Right.
And it maintained the concept of participatory democracy. And it had, therefore, a built-in system that maintained the movement here in Madison.
You tried to work out your differences in big meetings or lots of meetings, endless meetings?
Both. We called them monster meetings.
Yeah, I know. Not a good recruiting tool. Come forth, all ye lonely. We have meetings all night, every weekend. Yeah.
At the end of your presentation, you talked basically define participatory democracy. I was sitting here thinking, how does this differ from liberal pluralism? That is, pluralism as this notion that everyone has their interests and they come together in this democratic society, and if well organized enough, can function in the society to get their needs fulfilled. Please flesh that out a little bit. What's that distinction between this radical participatory democracy and liberal pluralism, which is still a dominant ideology, especially in a place like Madison?
Yeah, I wish we had liberal pluralism in America, but there is a difference. I think we rejected liberal pluralism as not enough because it was driven by organized groups that pursued interests, but there was no larger, for want of a better analogy, Greek concept of the common good, the agora, the theaters of participation, dialogue, and it came down also, liberal pluralism, to electing representatives in close elections who would take power away from you without accountability, because after you're done electing them, there was no clear way that they had to return the energy to the base. And so those would be the 2 ways. I don't think any of us rejected the idea of elections or voting, but the document poses questions, and they're still with us, about where that fits into participation. There's something inherently foul about representative democracy, in my opinion. But anarchism is only the flip side of that. It just leaves the question open. You know, how can you self-organize yourselves in enough places where everybody participates and there are outcomes that you can live with and mechanisms to revise and amend and maybe elect people who are your delegates to something and keep a close leash on them? All that would be much more in the nature of the participatory democracy notion then representatives who are chosen in primaries by interest groups and don't come back until the next reapportionment. Is that an answer? Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
I was wondering if you could say a little about the National Student Association, where they came from, what became of them, and why they were involved with the CIA.
Maybe Paul knows.
Before I answer that, let me say that the first time I met Tom was at a National Student Association conference in Manhattan, Kansas. Tom was on his way to Chicago, Illinois. It was 1968. And I remember Tom going well into the early hours of the morning, encouraging everybody to go to Chicago. And I think I've said this to you, Tom, that if I had been called as a witness at the trial, I would not have said anything about your encouraging violence, but I certainly would have said you encourage people to cross state lines.
Yeah. You simply didn't recognize those states. Anarcho-syndicalist phase, they weren't state boundaries were meaningless.
Now,
Anyway, the question.
What happened, it's interesting because in the 7 or 8 months preceding the Ramparts articles, I was involved, and there were a number of us who were complaining about the international desk at the National Student Association, and we referred to it as the Junior State Department.
Right.
We didn't realize how wrong we were. It wasn't the Junior State Department, it was the Junior CIA. But you have to go back into the early 50s and the post-World War era, where a good number of people on the left who were anti-communist saw the CIA as a very valuable asset in terms of discerning between progressive movements and communism. And as we get into through the 1950s, what happens is the CIA turns to the National Student Association and relies on it and funds the National Student Association. And what it expects is very simple. It expects students in the NSA to participate in international student conferences and report back. And I think what's important to recognize is, with very rare exceptions, did the NSA, National Student Association, actually attempt to change anything. It wasn't an advocacy group for the State Department or the CIA as much as it was an agency to collect information. And as we then get into the 60s and the war in Vietnam, there now becomes a conflict, because now these students are not only doing that, but they are also taking an active role in regards to U.S. foreign policy and opposing it. And so now the NSA is finding itself coming under greater and greater pressure from the CIA, and that's sort of where the lid came off and the conflict emerged, because I mean, you could not continue. And eventually, the innocents among us just thought it was a Junior State Department, and those who are a little more sophisticated figured it out.
It only came out, I think, because of the existence of Ramparts and the alternative press, and then some people were willing to say it. Yep, they were quite. This is not so long ago. They were quite good on domestic civil rights issues, the CIA front. And they were quite opposed to today's Republican Party, which was then the Young Americans for Freedom, that wrote their version of the Port Huron Statement at William Buckley's estate.
The Sharon Statement.
Exactly. Who Sharon was, I don't know, but it's the name of a town, a place. So I found in one of these meetings here or somewhere in the Midwest